The Men of Rushmore. This is one in a series of 4 programs on the Men of Rushmore, the 4 presidents that grace the mountain in South Dakota. And this one is on Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, a lordly cedar. On February 12, 1959, the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's birth, Carl Sandburg, the noted Lincoln biographer, addressed a joint session of Congress with these words: "Not often in the story of mankind does a man arrive on earth who is both steel and velvet, who is as hard as rock and soft as drifting fog, who holds in his heart and mind the paradox of terrible storm and peace unspeakable and perfect." He was speaking of a man who quite often was called Father Abraham and was referred to as Honest Abe, a master of expression, written or spoken. Though he became the 16th President of the United States, he retained 2 important gifts, the common touch and his humor. To illustrate both, a visiting ambassador came upon Lincoln polishing his shoes. "Why, Mr. President, do you polish your own shoes?" "Why, certainly, Mr. Ambassador. Whose do you polish?" That's the only joke in this thing. All through the long struggle of his life, and especially through the Civil War, he apparently had no hate and certainly harbored no wish for revenge. In this log cabin at Hodgensville, Kentucky, on February the 12th, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born. The log cabin was not unique to the Lincolns, since many families in the area lived in log cabins. And this is Sinking Springs Farm, and from this spring came the first water used by the baby destined to become president. This boundary oak was not quite as massive as at that time, but it could be seen from the Lincoln cabin. And a sad footnote about that oak: it has died and has been removed. The last time I was there, it was all gone. He lived here at Sinking Springs Farm only about 2 years before the family moved. Lincoln's next home was in the Knob Creek area of Kentucky, about 10 to 12 miles northeast of the birthplace. These are the little geological knobs covered with forests that give it the place its name. This is a reconstruction of the log cabin there. In this area, young Abraham grew to about 7 years of age. His father did not condone slavery, but it was probably farm title problems which prompted the move into southwestern Indiana to this farm. This farm was carved out of the wilderness, and during these years of growing to manhood, the axe and rail splitting became a part of Lincoln. He and his father cut this road or trace. I wish I could tell you that they did that fence also, but they did not. That came later. The farm, the outline of the old cabin which you're looking at, and a museum are preserved by the National Park Service. And on this farm his mother died and is buried. This bust of Lincoln is in the museum there at the farm. At Vincennes, Lincoln crossed the Wabash River into Illinois with his family. And he stayed on with the family for another year on the banks of the Sangamon River, just west of Decatur, Illinois, in a cabin like this reproduction. Then he moved on to New Salem, and he was in New Salem from 1831 to 1837. During these years, from Indiana to the Sangamon home to New Salem, one of his jobs was taking a flatboat down to New Orleans. This venture was probably his first real experience with slavery, and it was somewhere in the area where this picture was taken. His stay in New Salem was also the time that Anne Rutledge ended his life. The true impact on Lincoln of Anne Rutledge herself and then her early death is really not known. She's buried here at Petersburg, Illinois, not far from New Salem. New Salem is a reconstructed village built on the same foundations, building by building. But this one, the Cooper's shop, is an original, and it is the only original in New Salem. It was in this shop that Lincoln read by the light of the fire. Yes, that really happened. New Salem was a scene of his failure in the shopkeeping business and several other adventures one of the statues at New Salem, and then here is a second store in which a business failed. An ironic note, this statue is at Dixon, Illinois, where Lincoln served in the Black Hawk War. Now that was only a period of about 6 months, but it was here that he met Jefferson Davis, later President of the Confederate States, and Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States. But in New Salem he did win an election, and in 1834 began serving in the Illinois General Assembly in this chamber in the old State House at Vandalia, Illinois. In the years at New Salem, Lincoln studied law, and then in that same old State House at Vandalia, in 1836, he was sworn in to practice law in Illinois. The Illinois Chief Justice administered the oath in this room. During the time after that oath and extending into his Springfield days, Lincoln rode the law circuit. The Logan County Courthouse, found now in Greenfield Village, Michigan, was one of his stopping places. This New Salem statue of Lincoln riding and reading depicts that part of his life. Another courthouse where Lincoln stopped while riding the circuit can still be found today at Beardstown in Weston, Illinois. It is said to be the only courtroom used by Lincoln and still used for trials twice weekly. Now we're going into the second story of this building. The first story is the police station, but here is that courtroom. This courtroom was the scene of a murder trial, the Almanac trial, a Duff Armstrong trial, in which Lincoln won acquittal for his client. He used the Almanac to prove that the prime prosecution witness could not have identified his client by full moonlight, since the moon had set hours before the alleged identification. In 1837, Lincoln moved to Springfield and continued to serve in the state legislature in this chamber in what is now considered the old State House. The capital had just been moved from Vandalia to Springfield. His law office is on the corner just across from that State House. It's up on the 3rd floor there. In this room, Lincoln prepared hundreds of cases. He was a busy and a good lawyer. Many of those cases were tried in the same building in this courtroom. Now, to keep the record straight, this is the State House in use today. And a little footnote on history. The square at the old State House in downtown Springfield was the point of assembling for the Donner Party in 1846, the party that got marooned in the Sierra Nevadas, and many of them died. Lincoln married Mary Todd in 1842, and 2 years later they moved into this neighborhood in Springfield, into this home. The whole area is now part of the National Park System. In 1846, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, and so he left Springfield for Washington. His opposition to the Mexican War promised defeat for re-election, and so he chose not to stand for re-election. Lincoln experienced several more election defeats, and more than his share of hard experiences. But his words dug deep into the heart of a situation or issue, and he was becoming known as in places besides just Illinois, in the chambers of the legislature here in Springfield. In 1858, at a Republican state convention in the legislative chamber, this one in Old State House, Lincoln used these words: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Further on, same speech: "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Later, in Ottawa, Illinois, the Lincoln-Douglas debates began in the race for the Senate. And here at Old Main, at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, on those steps, the fifth and most famous of the debates occurred. Lincoln's stirring words were, "He is blowing out the moral lights around us when he contends that whoever wants slaves has a right to hold them." He lost that race also to Stephen Douglas. Lincoln was by now, even with various failures, moving towards the presidency. in an address in February 1860 in this building, Cooper's Union, New York City, "Let us have faith that right makes might." And candidate Lincoln attracted quite a crowd in front of his Springfield home. Now this map will help you locate several of the important places in Lincoln's life. Here's where he was born, right here in Hodgensville, Kentucky. And right up on the edge of my orange circle is that first reconstructed home where he lived to about 7. Then he moved over into this farm in southwestern Indiana, to the farm that's now part of the National Park Service. Here's where you saw that beautiful monument where the family crossed at Vincennes, crossed the Wabash River into Illinois. Now we're going up to here first because this is New Salem, and he lived there, and this is Springfield. And then we're going to drop down here to Vandalia. This was the old state house here, and this is where he first served. And then here's where that fifth of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the most famous, occurred at Galesburg, Illinois. And finally, from the interwoven threads of politics, Lincoln emerged as the new president, the 16th of the United States. Just before leaving for Washington, he received well wishes in this room in the old state capitol. Then, after an emotional farewell, he departed from Springfield at this little railroad station to assume office. The most notable words of his inaugural journey were spoken at the State House in Columbus, Ohio. "I look to the American people and to that God who has never forsaken them. There has fallen on me a task such as did not rest even upon the father of his country." Those words were spoken inside the Capitol in the legislative chamber that you're looking at. And then these words were spoken on the steps outside. "It is not much to me, for I shall very soon pass away from you. But affection for the Union is of immense value to you and your posterity forever." The dome of the Capitol in Washington was still unfinished when he gave his first inaugural address. And here's what it looks like today. On that day, March 4th, 1861, he gave this warning to the South. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is a momentous issue of civil war. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." By the time those words were spoken, South Carolina had long since seceded from the Union. That happened in December of 1860. Actually, a first shot had been fired on January 9th, 1861, on the ship Star of the West, which was trying to supply Fort Sumter, that fort that you're looking at with the flag, in Charleston Harbor. That's in South Carolina. This firing took place on this sandy point of land where I'm standing taking this picture, Cummings Point, by cadets from the Citadel in Charleston. Then the war really began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter from this spot by Southern forces on April 12, 1861. On that fort, Fort Sumter. And here are a few of the guns inside of that fort today. The end was 4 long years away. In those years, and in the years preceding the war, both North and South had forces of division at work. H.G. Wells, an outline of history, says this of Lincoln's position. But for Lincoln, there was no doubt. He was a clear-minded man in the midst of such confusion. He stood for the Union. He stood for the great peace of America. He was opposed to slavery, but slavery he held to be a secondary issue. His primary purpose was that the United States should not be torn into 2 contrasting and jarring fragments. So through the long 4 years of struggle, he stood out, an inflexible conviction, a steadfast will. Burnside Bridge at Antietam over in Maryland was the scene of the worst battle in terms of casualties in a day of any war except the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. This beautiful stream actually ran red with blood. And this is a painting depicting what they think it looked like. The net result was a slight Union victory. Also at Antietam is Bloody Lane. And I don't like to show them, but here are a few of the bodies from that battle. So Lincoln used that his wartime powers along with that slight Union victory on September the 17th, 1862, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation set free only the slaves in the states of rebellion. This is the late Henry Ladson Brooks. He couldn't read or write, but he could work, and I have worked in the fields with Brooks. His ancestors were slaves. The lives of Brooks's ancestors were governed by people not of their own choosing. Their names were found on documents like these, bills of sales and promissory notes, not on birth certificates like yours and mine. Here's a close-up. Read, for you and I can read. And this particular one reads, a Negro woman named Mary and her two children, Henry and Amanda, warranted sound. And quite often when a woman was named on a bill of sale, the wording would also include future issue. Children not yet even conceived would nevertheless be born into slavery. So that paper and this medal with its number hanging around the neck of a person enslaved him or her. This Southern newspaper, Columbia, South Carolina, came out very near the end of the war. You're looking at the front page. And note the ads for runaway slaves and for the auctioning of slaves. There had been many battles, and the cost of both sides was staggering, but the war ground on. Lincoln, in a message to Congress in December 1862, said, in times like the present, men should utter nothing for which they would not willingly be responsible through time and in eternity. And further on, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on July the 1st through 3rd, 1863, the Confederacy reached the high water mark of the war, the northernmost penetration. In the wheat fields held by Union forces, this spot, the fighting was intense, as it was in the peach orchard. And note that the peach orchard is still in peaches. From down in positions in Devil's Den, and Devil's Den is right down in through here, Confederate sharpshooters picked off Union soldiers on Little Round Top, and this is Little Round Top. Today on Cemetery Ridge, the Confederate cannons are silent, but once they fired towards Union lines on Cemetery Ridge. This North Carolina monument by Borglum, he's the one that carved Mount Rushmore, is an indication of the tensions in the moments before and during Pickett's charge across this field towards Cemetery Ridge. They were heading for this little copse of trees. Confederate losses were extremely heavy, and then the Southern tide retreated southward. 15,000 had charged shoulder to shoulder in a line 1.5 miles across, and only 50 minutes later, only 5,000 were left to retreat southward. I've also heard this stated as 13,000 in the charge, with 3,000 to 4,000 left. When Lincoln came on November 18, 1863, the sound of battle, though raging elsewhere, was gone from the Gettysburg battlefield. This is the cemetery where his address was delivered. And this is the commemorative statue up in that little group of trees. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. And further on, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. No reference was made to Union or Confederacy, simply brave men. Many battles were still in the future. Many more would breathe their last on the soil of their own land. Later, on the White House lawn, I shall do nothing through malice. What I deal with is too vast for malice. And from the second inaugural address in 1865, and this is an actual photograph, remember they had photography then, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations. Here in the McLean House at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April the 9th, 1865, that was Palm Sunday, Grant and Lee agreed to terms and surrender documents were signed. Grant and Lee had one last meeting on horseback, and then they left Appomattox Courthouse. Close by are the surrender grounds. The Union forces drew up on the left, the Confederates came up on the right and laid down their arms. It actually wasn't quite that simple. The surrender took many, many hours. There was a land of cavaliers and ladies called the Old South, a land of cotton plantations and magnolias, a time of elegance and aristocracy. Look for it now only in books, for it is a dream only dimly remembered, a moment of time that has gone with the wind. Only a few hundred yards from the McLean House is a small cemetery which contains 18 Confederate soldiers and 1 Union soldier, where that little U.S. flag is. Francis Miles French wrote a poem, The Blue and the Gray, which is appropriate. These in the robings of glory, those in the gloom of defeat, all with the battle blood gory in the dust of eternity meet, under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the laurel, the blue, under the willow, the gray. At Chattanooga, Civil War dead lie on a knoll by the flag. At Arlington National Cemetery, this tomb of 478 unknown dead of the Civil War is overshadowed by the pomp of the unknown soldiers' graves of World War I and II. Union forces paraded on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington to celebrate the end of the war. The Union was badly torn, but it was preserved. The guns and the battle cries were stilled. The grass and other elements of nature began to cover the physical scars. People tried to pick up the pieces and find their way. A difficult task anywhere in the country, but especially so in the South. Quiet reigned. But while Abraham Lincoln was sitting in this chair, less than a week after the surrender, one more shot was fired. In the words of Walt Whitman, "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills." My Captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arms. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. This is a funeral procession passing Union Square in New York City. And up in this room, one of those 2 children is Theodore Roosevelt. That is his grandfather's house. And of course, he later became president. Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14, 1865, Good Friday, and died the next day. Special train took his body back home to Springfield, Illinois. Carved models of one of the locomotives and the train are at the Waltham Museum in Dover, Ohio. The next to the last car contains the miniature coffin. A sustained outpouring of grief accompanied the train. This is the monument marking his grave, a reminder of battle on each corner, an unfitting tribute to such a man. But there is a good statue of him, and inside, this is the tomb. And this is a copy of the last known photograph of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln, being a man of humor, would probably appreciate these two pictures. That is, after getting over the shock of being depicted on Mount Rushmore. A ranger has been lowered in a bosun's chair to examine the face for cracks. This is in the fall of the year, and they want to repair them before the winter. If he didn't laugh at that one, I guarantee you he would laugh at this man sitting on the end of his nose. And this footnote seems appropriate. Stephen Douglas, who was Lincoln's opponent in those famous debates and who defeated him in that Senate race, became one of Lincoln's staunchest supporters. In refusing to participate in a drive for a monument for a friend, Lincoln once said, "Let him have the marble monument, along with the more enduring one in the heart of those who love liberty unselfishly for all men." Yet all over this country and in other lands, a likeness of Abraham Lincoln stands as a monument in small town parks or in the magnificent Lincoln Memorial in Washington. That one was done by Daniel Chester French. Now you're going to see various monuments to Lincoln, including a painting by Eisenhower, a wood carving in Summit County, Ohio, 3 statues in foreign lands, and ending with a statue within the Lincoln Memorial. I'll show you the first 3 because they're the foreign land ones, and then I'll go on. This one is in Oslo, Norway, a little dark perhaps. This one is in London, right by a statue of Sir Winston Churchill, and this one is in a cemetery in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, while you're looking at the rest of them, I'll be reading Edwin Markham's poem, Lincoln, the Man of the People, which he read when the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in 1922. When the Norn mother saw the whirlwind hour greatening and darkening as it hurried on, she left the heaven of heroes and came down to make a man to meet the mortal need. She took the tried clay of the common road, clay warm yet with the genial heat of earth, dashed through it all a strain of prophecy, tempered the heap with thrill of human tears, then mixed the laughter with the serious stuff. Into the shape she breathed the flame to light that tender, tragic, ever-changing face, and laid on him a sense of the mystic powers, moving all hushed behind the mortal veil. Here was a man to hold against the world, a man to match the mountains and the sea. The color of the ground was in him, the red earth, the smack and tang of elemental things, the rectitude and patience of the cliff, the goodwill of the rain that loves all leaves, the friendly welcome of the wayside well, the courage of the bird that dares the sea, the gladness of the wind that shakes the corn, the pity of the snow that hides all scars, the secrecy of streams that make their way under the mountains to the rifted rock, the tolerance and equity of light that gives as freely to the shrinking flower as to the great oak flaring to the wind, to the grave's low hill as to the Matterhorn that shoulders out the sky. Sprung from the west, he drank the valorous youth of a new world. The strength of virgin forests braced his mind. The hush of spacious prairies stilled his soul. His words were oaks and acorns, and his thoughts were roots that firmly gripped the granite truth. Up from log cabin to the Capitol, one fire was on his spirit, one resolve, to send the keen axe to the root of wrong, clearing a free way for the feet of God, the eyes of conscience testing every stroke to make his deed the measure of a man. He built the rail pile as he built the state, pouring his splendid strength through every blow. The grip that swung the axe in Illinois was on the pen that set a people free. So came the captain with the mighty heart, and when the judgment thunders split the house, wrenching the rafters from their ancient rest, he held the ridgepole up and spiked again the rafters of the home. He held his place, held a long purpose like a growing tree, held on through blame and faltered not at praise. And when he fell in whirlwind, he went down, as when a lordly cedar, green with boughs, goes down with a great shout upon the hills, and leaves a lonesome place against a sky. Consider Abraham Lincoln's humble beginnings, his time at New Salem and Springfield, Illinois, and all of his misfortunes, political and otherwise. Then follow that with thoughts of what he was as President of the United States with a terrible civil war raging around him. Think deeply about what he did for our country, and you must conclude that this was a great man.
Put sauce on.